Good morning. Today we are going to do the essay, which is there part of our syllabus, Literary Movements 1, MA first year, Romantic Analogues of Art and Mind by M.H. Abrams. Now, this essay is introduced by an extract from Herman Melville's Moby Dick, referring to how opinion swings between contrary philosophies. Sometimes one agrees with Locke and moves towards him in agreement, but soon one feels the compelling need to agree with Kant, so back one moves again. Maybe made wiser by the comparison, or maybe more confused by the opposing philosophies. This, by Abrams, was a way of introducing to the readers of the essay the positive and negative aspects of being exposed to a variety of viewpoints. The point he was trying to make through the reference is the important balance struck between the heads of two dead whales tied to the ship Pequod, affecting the ship's stability. So, also, in an erudite human world where knowledge, beliefs, ideologies abound and change over a passage of time, it is essential to strike a balance and try not to go overboard. This essay is part of a book written by M.H. Abrams on romantic theory and the critical tradition. The interesting title of the book, of which this essay is a part, is The Mirror and the Lamp: Romantic Theory and the Critical Tradition. It is interesting because the mind has been compared to the mirror and the lamp. As a mirror, it is like a reflector of external object. As a mirror, the mind only imitates what it sees. In this argument, the importance of the poet is reduced. Someone who merely conveys without coloring it with his or her own perceptions is definitely less creative than one who conveys what he sees or she sees, what he or she sees. I'm trying to be gender neutral here. Uh, but after it has been suffused in the temperament, the emotions, the sensations existing within the poet, that is. And that's where the lamp is different from the mirror. The lamp provides an additional light which shows off the various nuances of the object being viewed. The mind as the mirror is Aristotle's theory of mimesis or imitation. And when Wordsworth talked about how he gazed intently at objects, internalized it, recollected it in tranquility, calling it a spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings, preface to Lyrical Ballads, 1801, he was directing critical opinion to a different take on creative productivity, one which stemmed from fluids within a poet, not necessarily bound to surroundings, audience, and an awareness of any art as a premeditated process with a purpose, as was the neoclassic model. It took about 30 years for this theory to gain credibility in the works of critics like Keble, Carlyle, and John Stuart Mill. The words express or utter point to, in their oldest forms, as Latin expressare or Old English out, signifying an action by which matters inside of anything are pressed out by force. The metaphor of mirror used for a poet symbolizes the poet as a mimic who merely reports what he sees. There is no pressing out of feelings and emotions from within him as a consequence of seeing an external object as inspiration. This imitation theory of Aristotle is subtly criticized by Sir John Keble as cold and inadequate notion of the writer's meaning. The 1830s saw various definitions of poetry which talked of expression as against imitation. Coleridge, Hazlitt, Shelley, Byron, Leigh Hunt have all talked about poetry as an expression of something. There are interesting references to poetry as volcano and childbirth by Byron. Apart from being referred to as an overflow or expression, poetry was also called the exhibition of the inner state or states of human sensibility by John Stuart Mill. So Walter Scott talked of how the painter, orator, and poet brought about or evoked the same passions within the spectator, hearer, or reader, thereby establishing for the first time that art could be a means of communicating and bringing equality between the artist and his audience. If poetry is a mirror of the external world, it was now tweaked a little by the 19th century critics, saying that yes, poetry reflected the external world, all right, in the words and expressions, but it was a reversed reflection. In the delineation of the external world, the Romantic poet also exhibited his mind and its state. So the reflection was suffused with the inner being of the poet, which kind of brought out its affinity to the analogy of a lamp. The mirror reflects an exact copy, but the lamp enhances with the light. So, the romantic analogues of the mind and art make it necessary for us to view poetry as a reflection, not cold and inadequate, but with a light which shows up the reflection with better clarity and profusion. Ut pictura poesis is a Latin phrase which means as is painting, so is poetry. Simonides of Chaos, 556 to 468 BC, has said, Poema pictura locens, pictura poema silens, which means that poetry is a speaking picture while painting is silent. The relevance of this ancient statement is to bring into context the superior role of music as an analogy of poetry as compared to the previous one of painting. Music began to be considered in Romantic criticism as the more closer brethren of poetry as compared to painting. If words written by poets produce a picture which the reader is able to see in his imagination, the relevance of of music to poetry cannot be undermined. But it was considered most non-imitative or most non-mimetic until the German writers in 1790s began to talk of music to be most expressive of one's spirit and emotion. Music was said to be the most natural spiritual companion of poetry, and Simonides felt it was a foregone conclusion for him to deserve an independent affirmation when he called poetry a speaking picture. According to him, music is inherent in poetry and thus more related to poetry than painting is. Here we need to learn about the lyric in order to appreciate the very emphatic claim of music on poetry than that of painting. The lyric is a verse form expressing very spontaneous feelings and emotions of the poet's heart, played to the music of the lyre. The Aeolian lyre, which was invented by Athanasius Kircher in 1650, was a favorite piece of every household, solely preyed by the strumming of varying winds upon its strings. It remained a topic of much excitement and description after the mid 18th century. Called a wind harp, its very authentic affiliation to nature made it a popular symbol of the harmonious intermingling of humans and nature. In the 19th century, it became an analogy for the poet. The lyre is the poet over whom the series of external and internal impressions are driven. They not only produce melody but a harmony by a unique adjustment between the internal sounds and motions. Hazlitt and Coleridge also talk about the combined effect of the external and internal, vaguely similar to the mimetic theory of the past, but new and more metaphysical in its logical understanding. Schilling's psycho-natural parallelism says that essences within nature have a duplicate subsistence in the form of ideas in the mind. Thus, John Keble talks of how music and poetry are like twin sisters. As one can surmise from these opinions as to what is poetry, whether it is a mere reflection of external objects seen by the poet, or whether the poet's inner temperament gives the reflection an added radiance of the lamp, it is evident there are cross currents happening between the two philosophies. Neither can do without the other, it seems. Namely, if you ponder a little about Hazlitt, who lived between 1778 to 1830, somewhat confused definition. Hazlitt said, neither a mere description of natural objects nor a mere delineation of natural feelings, however distinct or forcible, constitutes the ultimate end and aim of poetry. Wordsworth said that I have at all times endeavored to look steadily at my subject. He dismisses that anything which is observed with no interference from the emotions of the observer as inferior, because that means the higher faculties of the mind are still passive and subordinate to external objects being observed. Thomas Quincy, J.S. Mill were in agreement with this opinion. Agitation, fear, love all distort or magnify the object, said Abrams. Coleridge was most concerned with the imagination, which helped, along with feelings, color the external objects. How the mind, poetic mind, acts to modify or transform materials of sense without violating truth to nature was his theory of imagination. This transforming act of passion, changing inanimate to animate, or humanizing nature, or making internal external and external internal, makes the theory of romanticism so interesting. This occurred in deliberations of most poets of the time. Wordsworth answers the question, what is a poet? By saying, he is a man who rejoices more than other men in the spirit of life that is in him, delighting to contemplate similar volitions as manifested in the goings on of the universe, and habitually impelled to create them where he does not find them. Prosopopoeia, or personification, became a common rhetorical device to gauge the faculty of imagination. Even though the question of the ideal in poetry, which was the popular theory propagated by Plato and his disciple Aristotle through mimesis, lost its importance with the Romantics, it didn't exactly fade into insignificance. It makes its presence felt in Shelley's Platonistic formulation that poetry lays bare the naked sleeping beauty of the world, or Blake's words to generalize is to be an idiot, to particularize is the alone distinction of merit. From mirror to lamp to many other analogues like fountain, volcano, childbirth, the reasons for this plethora of metaphors for the poetic creation process is the changing perspective, which is a natural part of evolving knowledge of the human world. Aristotle talked about an interesting analogy, the impression of not of only an image on a signet ring on a hot piece of wax without getting the metal or gold of the rest of the ring into context. Locke says the mind is like a tabula rasa on which images get fixed, or the camera obscura analogy, which describes the external and internal senses as windows through which light enters into an otherwise dark world. Both Coleridge and Wordsworth prefer to regard the mind as active rather than a passive receptor, as mind controlling the senses and not vice versa. Plato and Plotinus are credited with being the reflector and projector sources, respectively. Plotinus's basic figure of creation, the one and the good, has been shown to be an overflowing fountain, a radiating sun, or a fountain of light. The Cambridge Platonists, who were believed to be more Plotinists than Platonists, talked of the spirit of man to be the candle of the Lord, which gave impetus to the changing perceptions from mirror to lamp. Nathaniel Culverwell, 1619 to 1651, in an elegant and learned discourse on the nature of light, didn't see this controversy getting resolved in this life, but also rather hesitantly concluded human perception of the divine flow is like a naked glass receiving and faithfully returning all colors. This after having stated that the Creator is the fountain of light from whom emanated the intellectual lamps passed on to the lower part of the world. Thus are the Neoplatonists or the Cambridge Platonists called Plutonists in reality. And what if all of the animated nature be but organic harps that tremble aye to thought as over them sweeps, plastic and vast, one intellectual breeze at once the soul of each and God of all. Coleridge in 1795. Now I'll stop this here so that I can continue the next part of the lesson in another video. Thank you.